past 12 months have perhaps been the most defining in India's recent history. Rewind to the same time last year, it was a paralyzed government, stalled decision-making, weak macroeconomic fundamentals, and India was simply not on the radar of global investors.
And then came the watershed movement, an electoral mandate like no other in the last 3 decades. A billion hopes riding on one man alone. Prime Minister Modi stormed to power. He promised to revive our fortunes. He promised achhe. So what do the last 365 days look like? On Modi 365, the big debate, we've got Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, Dr. Subir Gokarn, Swaminathan Aiyar and Mukesh Butani to analyze the performance of this government. Ms. Shaw, I'll start with you. Do you think that Prime Minister Modi and his government have done justice to the political capital that he had?
Well, I personally believe that, we have to view the performance of this government in a very fair way, because I think when the government came in, expectations were set very, very high. And I think the government today is trying to manage those expectations, because I don't think they factored in some of the huge challenges of change management. I think, they didn't expect the kind of pushback from the firmly entrenched bureaucracy. They did not expect this enormous hostility from the opposition, and I think they are finding it therefore difficult to do things in an expeditious manner. But having said that, I think you have to look at what they have achieved in this last 1 year. I think financial inclusiveness through the Jan Dhan Yojana scheme is a huge, huge win for this government. And I think they've effectively delivered on this. Then you look at the various auctions and public sector divestments that they've started with. I think that's also a step in the right direction. I think where the impatience sets in from corporate India is that they are not seeing regulatory ease of doing business. And I think that's where the government is doing a lot behind the scenes. But I think, as we all know, we would like it to be a far more transparent and open process.
That's a fair point, and I'm going to talk about each one of them in detail in just a bit. But Dr. Gokarn, I have to also begin touching upon the topic of achhe. He had promised us that if you look at the macroeconomic fundamentals, they have improved significantly. One can't deny that. Can you in the last 1 year?
Well, part of that is external, part of that is a gift from global developments that's very clearly reflected in oil prices, and even though they've gone up a little bit recently, they're still much more moderate than they were when the government came to office, and generally commodity prices have declined. But part of that is also internal, and I think I want to focus specifically there on the food inflation issue. The government's done 2 things that have helped to contain food inflation. They're short-term measures, and we still await a long-term agricultural strategy, but let's put that aside for the moment. 2 things. One is that this was the last act of the UPA government in 2014 was to increase minimum support prices for the Kharif season last year by just 2% compared to an average increase of about 15% for the 4 years preceding. And then this government followed up in October by raising procurement prices for Rabi also by 2%. That was a significant contributor to food inflation easing. This was, of course, complemented quite significantly by the sale of open market sales of wheat and rice stocks starting from June last year, and that has actually taken cereal inflation down. Cereal inflation is very high in the 2 years preceding the government, coming particularly rice. It's now down to about 2%. So this has been a huge factor in the easing of the macroeconomic situation, bringing inflation down, probably helping to some extent to curb wage increases and so on. Of course, on the other side, you're starting to see concerns about rural distress, so there's always, a pros and cons. But I think from a macro perspective, containing food inflation is something that the credit must go to this government for doing these 2 things. And of course, it goes back to the early decision to cap the increase on MSPs, which I think has been a very large contributor.
Right. Swami, you don't seem to be too impressed with the macros that are looking up. The numbers are much better on almost every parameter than what they were a year ago. What do you make of the macro performance?
The macro conditions are very good. Has this therefore spurred economic activity of every kind? The answer sadly appears to be no. If you look at the corporate results, they have been absolutely dismal. For the September-December quarter, the growth rates were so bad that I remember Reuters Thompson coming out saying that this is the worst quarterly results for the last 18 months. But now the quarterly results for January, March are coming out and they look to be even worse. So you have these 6 months, these first year of Modi ending on a very sour note, saying, look, at the macro level, various things were well done. Why is it then that the actual outcomes in terms of production, employment, profit, investment, why is none of this taking off? So this is the big question to be asked. And if you cannot ultimately deliver on those outcomes, there's no point saying I did well on the macro side. What matters is at the individual level. I would say the best sign of disillusionment in this was the Delhi election. Just 6 months, 7 months earlier, Modi won all 7 parliamentary seats. And then you have a state election and the BJP wins only 3 out of 70 seats. Look at the difference. So I would say that a lot of foreign portfolio investors, a lot of Indian investors still have quite a lot of faith. They say Modi is doing a lot of reforms. All this is going to take much longer than we thought. But we do believe that ultimately, with a lag, the economy is going to pick up in a big way. However, as of now, it seems that the portfolio investors, they have more patience than the voters. So in some sense, the critical thing coming is the Bihar election. Modi did very well in that state in the general election. And it's an open question. Can he win the state now?
All right, we'll talk politics at a later stage, at a later date, Swami. I'm going to keep it strictly economic. And Mr. Butani, if I may come to you, are people less wary of arbitrary action like it was happening a year back than they are now? I'm not specifically talking just tax here.
I don't know. I think in the overall scheme of good things that are happening besides these sentiments, the baby steps that the government is taking predominantly from the point of view of ease of doing business is something that is getting missed out. Well, the larger reforms bill, we all know why it is getting held back. You cannot have any material uptake on infrastructure or on core industries such as cement or steel until and unless significant bills like land bill gets passed. You're not going to have a significant uptake from a GDP standpoint until and unless you bring a lot of stuff which is lying in the parallel economy until the GST bill gets passed. So I think that we are missing out the larger picture, and I think this government seems to have done much beyond creating a positive impact, whether it's like signaling the right, giving the right messages to domestic and foreign investors, so on and so forth. And you also have to view all of this in the backdrop of what was a virtual policy paralysis for at least 5 years, if not 10 years. So I think we are missing out on the larger picture. I think we are also missing out on the larger resolve and intent of the government. Don't we all know why the critical bills of land acquisition and GST did not get passed? Don't we all know the frustrations that this government went through to get passage of an insurance bill to raise the FDI from 26 to 49 when this was on the agenda of the UF government way back in 1998? Yes, all of the external factors that Subir talked about by way of inflation, easing of commodity prices, RBI's actions in the right direction have augured well for the new government. But I think that we still need to see the impact of all of this, and I am confident that as the investment cycle picks up, you would see a material uptake in the growth levels, so on and so forth. At least this government is reactive. It is responding.
Ms. Shaw, let's look at some of the pet themes of this government. Make in India, digital India. These are all grand vision statements and no one disputes them. But fundamentally, if you look at it in a more granular sort of a manner, you realize that there is just no enabling framework for these, visions for these visions to translate into reality. Whether it comes to manufacturing, telecom, the policy enabling environment is just not there. So what's your sense? Is that why we haven't seen the investment cycle turn?
Well, actually, if you look at the whole policy area, I think you can clearly see that we need systemic change in our policies. If you want to really unleash the potential of manufacturing, digital India, smart cities, but I think you can also see that the government is really seized of all the issues that are not making it possible to deliver on all these policies very effectively and expeditiously. So if you actually think about it, make in India is a great statement, but if you look at how difficult it is to make in India, you need to address all of that. For instance, I know that we ourselves are working as an industry body to look at just SEZ issues and see whether those can be enabled, simplified and strengthened. Similarly, I'm sure each sector has its own set of issues which must be expeditiously dealt with to really make it easy to get into the manufacturing sector. Similarly, if you look at digital India, smart cities, at least I'm happy that the government and Prime Minister Modi has put together a crack team to really make sure that some of the big infrastructure projects are underway. Now, I recently come from the US, where I can certainly tell you that the investor sentiments in the US are very positive. If you look at it, I understand that since the Modi government took over, bilateral trade has increased 4%, the FDI has increased 40% and FII has increased 400%. Now, of course, recently we've also seen down-rating of, India. But I think overall the sentiments for investment are very strong. So if we don't seize this opportunity of cashing in on these positive sentiments, we are going to lose a huge opportunity. And so time is of the essence.
Right. Ms. Shaw, you made a very valid point there. FDI is coming in, FIIs are a bullish lot. What about the domestic investor? And Dr. Gokarn, I'm going to throw this to you. Why is India Inc. so wary of parting with its money and begin investing in India?
Well, I think this really highlights the one area on which the government has not moved as much as it should have in the first year, which is infrastructure. We all know that the PPP model as conceived 5-7 years ago has not delivered. We can go into the diagnostics of why it hasn't delivered and so on. There's been enough of that. But all of that has now resulted in the premise that we need to get more public resources into infrastructure. And in order to do that, we had a number of budgetary commitments, both direct commitments and the setting up of the National Infrastructure and Investment Fund, which was supposed to act as a kind of a nodal institution to get public funds back into infrastructure. It hasn't been operationalized yet, and I think we need to move forward as fast as possible on that. But the bottom line here is that domestic investment, capital formation, is now completely hostage to infrastructure. I don't see any business putting money into expanding assets, expanding its capacity, if it does not see some credible movement on infrastructure. And with all those projects stalled, you can see that the system is getting more and more stretched, more and more stressed out, and the profitability of any new investment is going to be compromised by the lack of access to infrastructure, whether it is power, whether it is transportation, whatever it is. And I think that is really, to me, the one soft spot, the one weak spot.
Swami, let's talk about the big picture. One would have expected a lot of structural reforms given the mandate and the nature of the mandate and the political capital that the Prime Minister has. Do you think that Prime Minister Modi has been too gradualist? Has he been a little too soft on crucial reforms like GST and land bill? Could he have been more aggressive?
So I would say that it is not true that Modi is doing very little or doing very little. He is advancing on his own position. He has been more aggressive in 2015 than he has been in 2014. And I think it would be justified to say that he sees the need for action and is moving ahead. What I don't understand is why he is not willing to confront the Congress, say, okay, you defeat me in the Rajya Sabha and let's go for a joint session of Parliament where we will win. I think he needs to use that particular instrument to prove how strong and serious he is. If he, on the other hand, keeps giving way and say, let's have a joint select committee, I think he's displaying a sign of weakness, and that is a failure.
Ms. Shaw, if I may come to you, purely speaking from corporate India's point of view, and I'm going to carry forward that structural reform bit, like Swami was pointing out there, he needs to take the opposition head on. Is that something that corporate India would have expected to, given his political capital, at least in the lower house, 282 MPs, the first Prime Minister in liberalized India to have that kind of a majority? Has that been a disappointment that he hasn't really taken on the opposition, or is this political pragmatism that you're willing to make peace with?
You know, it's a bit of a Hobson's choice. I mean, let's be fair. He tried very hard to push through a large number of reforms, but he has suddenly found it very, very difficult to basically get the opposition to fall in line. Now, if he actually pushes through the reforms, then basically he's called very autocratic and bulldozing. And if he sort of seeks some kind of a consultative process, then everyone says, oh, he's not bold enough. So I think he's basically trying to gauge what is the best way of getting it done. I think what Swami said is very correct. I mean, I do hope he resorts to the joint session of Parliament to push some of these big important reforms. I think the two critical ones are certainly GST and the land acquisition bill, and I think those two are going to be extremely important to set the agenda. But equally, I think what Subir said is very important. I think infrastructure is actually what is actually stalling investment, because without optimal infrastructure, I really don't think you're going to see the huge investments that we need. I think we definitely can see that India has suffered very, very gravely because of a lack of investment in infrastructure, and that has to be top priority. And at least I'm seeing that, you know, the Prime Minister is actually focusing on that, but he needs to deliver on that very, very expeditiously.
Mukesh, Butani, let's talk tax. And you spoke earlier about the government being reasonably reactive in that front. But, you know, the government promised to clear the air on taxation when it came to power. It said it will bring in transparency and clarity on tax policy. 365 days later, whichever expert you speak to, the sense that one gets is that's just not come through. Look at the way they've handled the entire MAT issue, the lack of clarity there. It's been disappointing. Would you concede that on the taxation front, where much was needed to be done, the government has been a bit of a letdown?
I think it all depends. The answer to your question depends on what context do you give. So if you look at the larger macro statement that this government is committed to not bringing retrospective law, I think the government made that commitment in the budget 2 of 2014, and it repeated its commitment in 2015. If you look at signaling, what do they want to do with the 5-year direct taxes code draft, which was at its 3rd draft level, I think that also there is clarity. If you look at resolve of the government to go ahead with the GST, I think it's very clear that they want to implement the GST in 2016. When you talk about tax reforms, the tax reforms are really at 2 levels. Number one, what is it that the government can do in the parliament as a part of the legislative process? Now, the finance bill is always a money bill. So, the math of upper house and lower house really doesn't matter, because the government can do pretty much anything on tax reforms through the legislative agenda. But the larger part of the debate is, what is it doing on the non-legislative part of the agenda? Passing an act or an income tax law in the parliament is just one act. How do you administer the law, for which you need deeper administrative reforms? I don't think that these reforms are something that can be achieved in a time frame of 12 to 15 months. If you simply look at the Tax Administrative Reforms Commission, which has made 4 reports, far-reaching recommendations, implementation of some of these will take up to 7 to 8 years. You need investment in IT, you need to have attitudinal change in the tax authorities, you need to imbibe the idea of taxpayer services, so on and so forth. To your point on FII on MAT, yes, the government has gone back and forth, but I don't think that the FII issue on MAT is a case of retrospective legislation. It's simply that the government should not have carried out any change in the finance bill of 2015. You need to be a 2nd year or a 3rd year law student to come to the conclusion that the MAT legislation, which is a 1992 legislation, clearly says there is no question of levy of MAT. So I think the mere fact that the government went ahead and clarified with all good intentions has resulted in the government boxing itself by saying, oh well, we can't give an exemption on a retrospective basis. So I think in the first place, there is no question of levy of MAT on an FII, and this bogey should not have been raised. Government, by clarifying it, has found itself in a corner. But I don't think it's a case of retrospective law.
Fair point indeed. I get your point there. The government has perhaps got itself into a corner by choosing to clarify on the tax issue, but it has done a lot of damage, I can tell you that. Dr. Gokarn, if I may come to you and ask you the big picture question, this really is on the big slogan that the Modi government began with, minimum government, maximum governance. Is that something that you have seen in the last 1 year? Because there are these people who are raising concerns about the concentration of power within the Prime Minister's office. Not everybody else is so empowered, and yet there are just too many decisions that are not being made by people authorized to make that decision. So has it really been a case of minimum government, maximum governance?
Well, I think you're putting two alternative interpretations on minimum government. I mean, one way of looking at minimum government is to say there's just one person making decisions. That's also a way of defining the government as minimum. But that's obviously not the outcome that we want. There is a bit of learning here. I mean, many of the ministers are first-time, even first-time MPs. They're certainly first-time ministers. The experience pool in this formation is relatively thin. So I would not grudge them a certain amount of learning, some sort of training period, probation period, if you will. But the question is, at the end of 1 year, does Mr. Modi have a sense of the ministers who are performing, who are coming to grips with the issues in their portfolios and starting to make suggestions and champion? And the minister's job really is to champion. He's not making proposals. Proposals will be made by the bureaucracy. Champion the right kind of issues within that domain. So I think some sort of realistic assessment of performance is absolutely necessary at this point to see who's doing well, in what position, can they be given more responsibilities. People are not doing so well, do you ease them out, or do you sort of marginalize them? These are sort of human capital decisions which the Prime Minister has to make. It's going to take some time. We have very short memories. These are problems that every government goes through in the first year or year and a half. But at some point you have to have the right people in the right place, and you have to have that for some of the critical ministries.
Fair point indeed. As it begins the second year, it needs to minimize all of that. But Swami, you've not been as critical as I perhaps expected you to be. So I'm going to ask you a question point blank. What has been the big failure of the last 365 days, according to you?
I would say that his biggest failure is on over-concentration of power in New Delhi. I mean, he came promising devolution to the states, and to some extent, it was forced upon him by the Finance Commission. So the spending power, in terms of spending power, the states are now going to be spending 62% of all government money. The central government is only going to be spending 38%. To that extent, there is dilution of power. But within Delhi, I mean, when Arun Shourie said that there is this triumvirate, the triumvirate of Narendra Modi, Amit Shah and Arun Jaitley, and almost all decisions have to be cleared by this triumvirate. Otherwise, people are afraid of going ahead on other things. That is not a good or smooth decision-making process. So excessive centralization has been one issue. The other issue that has been raised is whether the minorities are feeling somewhat unsafe. On this, I would say, to me, the surprise was the Christians beginning to feel unsafe. This was something that had not happened earlier. And I think it's also true to say that there has been some exaggeration by the media of some ordinary burglaries being portrayed as attacks on churches. But despite that exaggeration, the bottom line is that the minorities are not feeling secure. That is a negative. A large number of the academic, historical, cultural institutions are being filled with pro-RSS, pro-VHP type of people, which disconcerts some people, especially those of a leftist persuasion. So these, I would say, are some of the areas of failure.
All right, Swami, we'll take that. But I'll let Ms. Shaw have the last word on this debate. Are we being too impatient, Ms. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw? Is corporate India being too impatient? Or do you think that given the mandate, given the track record of Prime Minister Modi as a Chief Minister, the impatience is justified?
Well, as I said right up front, I think, they set expectations very high and unrealistic expectations at that. So I think what we are really, dealing with today is the government now trying to lower the expectations and manage expectations. But I think all I would like to say is that at least, you know, the roadmap that is being provided by the government is pretty reassuring. I think we should give them some more time, because I personally know that, you know, when you start wanting to bring about radical reforms, it's very, very difficult. Easier said than done. It needs to be done in a very different way. I think it is going to take time. But I think the commitment is there. And I think I can see that at the top, whether it's the minister or the top bureaucrat, there is a willingness to change. There is a sort of a overall self-compelling interest to change. But I think where we need to really bring about that change is lower down, where there is a huge, huge resistance to change. And that to me is the biggest challenge, which will get addressed, will get sorted out, because this is about shifting the mindset. I think some of my panelists also referred to that. So I think I'm very hopeful that at least in the next 365 days, things should look much better.
All right, you put it perfectly there. Let's just hope that the next 365 days are a lot better than the last 365 days. With Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, Dr. Subir Gokarn, Mukesh, Butani and Swaminathan Aiyar, thank you so much for joining in on the big debate on Modi 365. Supriya?
Oh, absolutely. I think, like our panelists put it brilliantly, irrational euphoria will have to perhaps make way for pragmatic and realistic expectations from the government. They've begun the walk, but they have a long way to go before the achhe din finally arrive. This is Modi 365, the big debate. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.